Okay, welcome to Sunoikis Digital Classics Summer Semester 2018. Today is the first common session of this part of the semester. This year we decided to split the long spring semester into two parts. We had a spring semester running from January through March, and we finished a few weeks ago, and now we have a second part, we call it summer semester, running from today through July. So we will have 12 common sessions until the beginning of July. Today, for our first common session, we have two guests, Hugh Cayless from Duke University and Valeria Vitale from the Institute of Classical Studies in London. This is the first time Hugh Cayless joins us, so Hugh, thank you very much for joining our community and contributing to it, while Valeria has been contributing a lot to Sunoikis, I have to say, in the last 2 years. And again, this semester, she will teach many different topics for Sunoikis. So today, the topic of our session is linked ancient world data. And as you know, you have the class outline on GitHub with a description of the topic. You have readings, assignments, and also the slides. So welcome to our guests. And I think the Hugh starts. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we've got a number of problems with sharing cultural heritage resources online. But one of the big ones is how do we stop ourselves from just having all these different silos of information? How do we work on the areas in which we are experts and produce materials for those, but at the same time link those up to other relevant sites built by other experts in other areas? And obviously, there are all kinds of ways in which cultural heritage web resources might overlap. They might share the same texts. They might share things like geographic regions. They might cover the same time periods. They might involve the same people. So there are all kinds of ways in which we might want to be able to connect up things that we publish online. Another problem is how do we contextualize the stuff that we publish? And again, this is linked to connecting things up as well. How do we find relevant information about our resources that might come from elsewhere? And also, once we publish something, is there any way we can have it stay up to date? Can we benefit when somebody else publishes something new that might be relevant to something we've already published? So we've got this kind of situation of data siloing. A proposed solution to this came out in the mid-2000s, published by Tim Berners-Lee, whose name you might recognize as the creator of HTML, among other things. So his idea was to use something he called linked data or linked open data to help mitigate these issues. And I've linked. You were asked to skim the linked data white paper. To be honest, I find it slightly incoherent, but it's definitely worth a read. And it comes with this idea of what he called 5-star linked open data, which I've tried to summarize here on the slide. the idea is you should publish your data. Obviously, you should publish it in with a open license so that other people can take it and use it. You should use machine-readable formats. Even better, you should use open machine-readable formats. So instead of putting up a Word document, you should maybe put up a TEI document or even just a text document. Instead of an Excel spreadsheet, you should put up comma-separated values, for example. You should also use open web standards to describe your data. And best of all, you should do all of these things, and you should link to other people's data as well. Now, the original linked data white paper explicitly mentioned something called RDF as a standard for number 4. I actually want to put off talking about RDF and explore some of the other issues around linked data first before diving into that. I've got my reasons. I will rant about that in a little bit. So if we're going to do these 5 things, right? Publishing with an open license, machine-readable formats, open web standards, and linking to other people's data, there are various foundations to that that process, that workflow that we have to think about first. So the things that have to be in place are, for example, open licenses, right? Can people use the data once they've got it? It's fine to put something out on the web, but what can I do with it once I've gotten your data? Can I do something to it and republish it myself? Can I take it and make it better and republish it? Can I add more information to it? There's also the question of, well, if we're going to link stuff, can we actually link to it? Can we depend on those links being stable? Can we depend on them, lasting at least a very long time, if not forever? If we link to something, will it still be there in 5 years, in 10 years? Open standards are important. Will our users be able to understand and use the formats we publish in for the foreseeable future? Is there good documentation for those standards? Are there committees or communities that work on maintaining those standards? Is there good documentation for them? So, is this stuff going to not only stay accessible, but stay readable for the foreseeable future? And then beyond all that, can people actually link to just the bits of data that they're interested in, right? Are you putting everything up in some kind of a monolith? Are you hiding everything behind a search interface, right? We've all seen sites like that where you actually have to type something in. You have to type in some kind of a query before you can get an answer back. And you might not easily be able to link into the particular thing that you found that you're interested in. So how you architect your site, how you break things up is very important as well. So I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. Open licensing, like I said, is obviously important. There are the Creative Commons licenses, which I hope you've heard of. These are generally good for content of all sorts. And they're possibly, well, they're the less restrictive the license, usually the better. So Creative Commons gives you all of these options, like you can take this, but you can't reuse it commercially, for example. Or you can take this and you can republish it, but you're not allowed to do anything to it before you republish it. So usually in terms of reuse, the less restrictive, the better. If you publish something and then, in 5 or 10 years, somebody wants to take it and make it better or reuse it, are they going to have to come and hunt you down in order to get your permission to do it? Or do you want them just to be able to not have any restrictions on what they're allowed to do? Are you willing to make this frictionless for other people? Obviously, all of this hinges on copyright. And that's a much larger question. You can only license something if you actually own the copyright to it. Dealing with ancient stuff is actually great because very often this stuff is well out of copyright, so it's public domain. But you do still have to consider things like national restrictions sometimes. There are countries that put restrictions on, say, images of cultural heritage artifacts and what you're allowed to do with those. There are sometimes some institutions will claim copyright on images again. Texts, very often, if they have critical apparatus with them, may have restrictions on those. So there's both the question of what you're allowed, what you can do with digital content, what you're allowed to do with it, and what you're going to allow other people to do with it. So there's a lot of thinking that has to go into how you're going to publish stuff and what you're going to allow other people to do with it. If you're doing web resources, there's also obviously code behind those. So this may be the code that helped generate the data that you're publishing. It may be the code that allows people to query and access that cultural heritage information. And are you going to publish that as well? And how are you going to license that? Creative Commons is generally less good for code. There are other licenses that are generally better, and I've linked to some of those here. The main kind of philosophical divide is: are you going to require people who use and reuse your code to republish it themselves, or are you just going to let them do whatever they want with it? And the GNU GPL requires, as some Creative Commons licenses do, that if you reuse it, then you have to also publish any derivative works, any modifications you've made to the software. Apache licenses, on the other hand, say, here, do what you like with it. There's no warranty. Knock yourself out. So all of these things are cultural and political decisions more than technological ones, right? What will the copyright holder allow you to do? What will your institution allow you to do? And then if you're getting grant funding, for example, for a project, very often funders will insist on open licenses for data and code. So you have to keep that in mind as well. So stable URIs. There's yet another W3C white paper about this. Basically, again, the idea is you want the web addresses where things are available to be stable over the long term, which means you have to think about how you're going to design your URIs before you actually do an implementation, before you actually publish. So again, there are technological questions around this, but it has more to do with long-term sustainability and management. But you have to keep in mind that having stable URIs means you have to actually have control over your web infrastructure. So you need to be able to do things like, if you do have to change the location of something, you have to be able to set up a redirect from the old address to the new one. You know, can you do stuff like that? Are you at a place where your system administrator will let you do things like that, or will do things like that for you? So again, there are kind of cultural and political questions that come into play here, as well as the technological ones. And well, open standards come into play basically everywhere here, starting with the formats for the data, and continuing through how the data gets delivered. So, you know, if you're going to use text, there's TEI, there are other formats, there's just plain text, there's HTML. You have to make the decision of what you're going to use based both on what your users will need and what kind of long-term sustainability questions you may have. For images, there are things like JPEG, TIFF, PNG. For tabular data, there's CSV. Again, the basic idea is you should use methods for storing and delivering your files that are your resources that are open and well documented, and basically stuff that's likely both to survive for a long time and also is well documented enough so that future people can take it and migrate it to a new format if need be. If it's locked up in some kind of a binary impenetrable format, there's a lot less stuff that people are going to be able to do with it. And then there's things to think about like protocols and delivery formats. I mentioned, you know, for example, not hiding stuff behind a search interface, which implies in HTTP world, you should use GET, where the thing in the address bar, the URL actually says this is what you're going to retrieve, rather than POST, which is where, for example, you're typing into a query interface and then you get something else back. So the URL in the browser doesn't denote the thing that you're retrieving. It doesn't actually name the thing that you're retrieving. So the main idea behind linked open data is that the URL you're using is actually kind of a name for, is an identifier for the thing that you're trying to get. And that brings us to referenceable resources. And again, this is an information design question. It's not purely technology. What things do you actually want to represent in your website? So ideally, everything you might want to refer to will have its own URL. Do you want to kind of break things up into usable chunks, rather than either just giving people a giant download, or again, hiding your information behind a query interface. So some examples here, you might have information about a person, for example. In the first URL, you might have information about a document in the second. If it's a document, how are you going to refer to parts of that document? How are you going to allow people to cite or bookmark pieces of it? So you could give people the whole document, maybe it's a whole book, maybe it's something really large, and you just have kind of identifiers for sections. Or maybe you took that large document and you broke it up into chunks. If it's a book, maybe you broke it up into chapters, for example, and each chapter has its own URL. So there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just something you have to think about. The other question is, do you want your identifiers to be opaque or not? And by that, I mean, just like these examples, do you want person 123, or do you want person / Monica _ Bertie, for example? there are pluses and minuses to both of these. You know, the advantage of having kind of proper names in your URL is it makes it more understandable, but you know, then you run into other questions. What if Monica changes her name, for example? Or what do you do about multiple Monicas? If you have multiple people with the same name, do you have, you know, Monica Bertie 1, Monica Bertie 2? You start to, with semantic identifiers like this, you start to run into all those kinds of questions, which you just completely bypass if you use opaque identifiers. So lots of people like opaque identifiers for that reason. So I wanted to, again, before we dive into the RDF, I wanted to give sort of my recipe for producing usable linked open data. And step one is get your data in shape first. You know, how good is your data? What's its relative quality? Do you have to do some work on it to get it into publishable shape? Do you have all the metadata that you need about it? Have you worked out the licensing for it? How's it going to be updated in the future? So do you have to think about versioning it? Are people going to, if you don't think about this, but you are updating, you know, what happens when somebody links to something and then you completely rewrite it 6 months later, so that the thing that their link points to is not really quite the same thing as it used to be? What if you take, you know, what if you have if you're talking about a person that you've identified from some documents, for example, what if you later decide that that person is actually two people who just have the same name? And so you have to split that record into two. You know, what happens then when you have a bunch of people who've linked to the first one but haven't linked to the second one because they were joined at that point? So maybe you have to have some sort of a data versioning scheme in place. Then you need to think about how people are going to get and use your data. Do you want to deliver it in big chunks, or do you want to break it up into individual records and documents, or do you want to do both? And actually, a lot of sites follow this kind of strategy. They'll have kind of more atomized chunks of information, but they'll also allow you to download the whole thing in one big chunk if you want to get it in that way. And so that can be very nice as well. If people want to run sort of a process, some sort of a process over all of your data, you don't actually want them hitting your website a million times. It would be much better if they took the data offline and did something to it locally. It'll be better for you and for them. It won't take your website down, and their process will run faster. And you also want to think about then how users are going to navigate your data. So how is your data going to be interlinked internally, and how is it going to link out to other resources? And what kinds of links are you going to have? Are you going to categorize your links in some way? Or are you going to treat them all just as sort of flat, plain links? So, you know, you can imagine, for example, navigation links versus give me more information versus give me some context. So it might be nice to be able to know what kind of a link this is that I'm activating. And once you get to that stage, now you're ready to think about what I've called the semantic web stuff, the RDF stuff. It should really be kind of the last step in the process. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on RDF. I think Valeria is going to talk about this some more as well. The basics of it are very simple, in fact, but you can do tremendously complex things with it. So RDF basically it is a big list of statements, and these statements consist of what RDF calls triples. So there's a subject, a predicate, and an object. The subject and the predicate are URIs, and the object may be a URI or what's called a literal, which is just a piece of data. So here's an example from the site papyri.info, and it says that this thing, ddbdp bgu12/source, is part of this thing bgu1. So that's essentially saying this particular papyrus edition, which is a TEI document, is a part of the volume in which it was originally published. So it's a fairly straightforward thing. Now, RDF is a graph because not only do you have these lists of triples, these lists of facts, but the URIs can point to each other. So one triple can be linked to another by dint of sharing either a subject or a predicate. So we've got that BGU12 source is part of BGU1. We've also got BGU12 without the source link, which is this thing. It's the page. That has as a topic the TEI source document. So the TEI source document, which is the transcription thing right here, that is a topic of the web page. The web page is talking about a bunch of things, and one of those things is the TEI edition, right? So the subject of statement number 1 is the object of statement number 2. So if you think about this, we're kind of building up this chain of information with the RDF. Another name for that is a directed graph. So a graph is just a chain of information like this. And because we're using web URLs as names for the bits of information in the graph, that means that we can use RDF to say useful things about our web resources in a machine-readable way. And yeah, it's the thing to remember about RDF is it's all triples, all of it. So this can be useful because we can use existing facts to produce new facts. So if we have A is related to B and B is related to C, then we can infer that A is related to C. And in fact, what we can do in RDF land is we can write a query that says, find cases like A is related to B and B is related to C, and make new triples saying A is related to C. And RDF uses what it calls schemas, or also called ontologies, to define the properties like is related to that it uses. And these themselves are just more sets of triples. And RDF can be queried, and I think Valeria may be talking about some examples of this. There's a language called Sparkle that provides a way to search RDF databases in the same sort of way that SQL lets you get information out of relational databases. It's a query language. So just quickly, there are complications around all of this. You know, there are questions of what URI. What does this URI I'm pointing to mean? Where do I get the properties I'm going to use from, and how do I know things about my facts? So if I want to say something about a person, for example, a real thing, not a web page, how do I do that in this context? And there are various strategies. You can use a special kind of redirect, and you can try this out yourself. If you paste that VIAF link into a browser, you'll notice that what you end up with is the same link, but with a slash at the end. So what's actually happened is the first one is talking about a person. It's talking about the historical Ovid, the author. but it redirects to the one with the slash at the end, which is the web page, which denotes all of his kind of published works. You can also mess around with the URL itself. There's this thing called the fragment identifier, which normally, that's the hash followed by this in this case. And normally that's used to point at a part of a large web page. But you can kind of reuse it and say, person 123 hash this. I'll use that when I'm talking about the person, and but the actual web page about that person is person/123. And you can do something called punning, which is basically to kind of throw up your arms and say, you're not actually going to confuse the web page and the person. So it's okay if I talk about the web page as if it were the person. This can get tricky, though, when you're actually talking about documents. Papyri.info deals entirely with documents, and we have to worry about the original papyrus, the editions of the papyrus, the TEI document that instantiates one of those editions, and then the web page that includes the transformation of that TEI document. These things are all documents, so punning actually wouldn't really work for us. And plus, this is confusing and no one cares. People who are casually using this stuff don't typically understand it or care about it. So the developers care, but the users don't, and that can cause problems as well. Just briefly, it's hard to know what Rdf vocabulary you're going to use, and Valeria is going to talk about this. You can use something like CDocCRM, which tries to do everything, or you can kind of mix and match. You can pick and choose from different ones and glue them together as needed. And, I did this thing called laud.info, for example, which actually attempts to do that in some trivial ways. And you can roll your own. Obviously, this might be a good way to start because you don't have to go searching for what you want to talk about. You can simply make stuff up. But you have to be a bit careful. You've probably seen this cartoon already, but we're going to fix everything. There are 14 standards. We're going to just cover everything. And you end up with, well, okay, now there are 15 standards. And lastly, before I hand over, another issue is RDF triples don't have context. So it can actually be hard to know where a particular fact comes from. So what if I have conflicting information, for example? How do I know how I know something? How do I know where that fact came from? Who first asserted this? And that can be quite tricky. There are a couple of technological solutions. There's one called named graphs, and that can work up to a point. Another possible solution is just don't try to use RDF for that sort of thing. It's not a good universal data format. So TEI, for example, provides ways of doing this kind of thing, and it might just be better. So there are good reasons to do linked open data despite all the difficulties. We can actually build a good interconnected cultural heritage web. And doing this stuff actually makes for really good web architecture. It makes your site more discoverable and more easy to get around. But you do need to be a little bit wary about the semantic web stuff, I think. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Valeria, who's going to talk about examples.
Okay, thank you. Valeria, you have to, okay, excellent.
Yes, I'm back. Yeah, thank you, Hugh. I'll try to add just a couple more points to your introduction to linked open data, but what I want to do mostly is to show you some example of projects that actually did use linked open data. So let's say some practical applications from the user's point of view. Okay, the screen sharing did actually work. Great. All right. So I would like to start with my favorite questions when we talk about digital humanities, which is, why would you do it? Why would you use linked open data in academic research? Well, these are some of my answers to that. Of course, each one has their own, but I think they make some good points for the use of linked open data, even though, you know, all the concerns that Hugh expressed are obviously very, very, you know, we're very spot on. So the first added value is, yeah, we have more data. If we can connect our data set to data sets that have been produced by other research groups, other institutions, that means that we have more, which is, you know, already great. But it's not just, you know, the sheer quantity that should be, you know, the only added value. Because these data are also interconnected semantically, which means to me at least two more important points. And one is that, again, on top of the value of the information, which is already really, really precious to us, we have the added value of the connections. And as humanists, we know that that is, you know, as important as the data itself, if sometimes not even more. And also, if the information about the objects we're talking about, intending objects, meaning objects in a very broad way, has been encoded quite extensively, or even, you know, relatively extensively, using those RDF statements that Hugh was talking about, that means that we can also perform some queries that can, in certain cases, become quite specific, and they can return, you know, exactly what we were looking for, or at least something that is close to what we were looking for in a much quicker and more efficient way than just, you know, looking into a lot of books in a library. But also, besides the practical benefits of using linked open data, I am particularly fond of, let's say, some ethical and methodological, if you want, meanings and of linked open data. And one is that we have our data, the information that we produce gets connected to the information produced by other people. And these other colleagues of ours, they may be looking at our same objects of interest, but from different perspectives. They may come from different disciplines, they may have different approaches, and combining these data may help us actually seeing something new that we wouldn't have thought otherwise. Also being, you know, let's say a non-hierarchical kind of data structure. So potentially everyone can contribute their data in a linked open data environment. That could also mean that some groups that might not have traditionally a very easy access to, or a lot of visibility, they become more prominent. They find more easily a voice into the academic debate. But also, linked open data, as he was saying, they have this strange status of being partially understandable by humans most of times, but also being machine readable, which means that we can, you know, post-process them in a number of ways. We can perform, you know, visualizations. We can create graphs, and looking at linked open data through these other tools may help us, for example, identify patterns or trends, or even spotting gaps or inconsistencies and asking ourselves, okay, why there is a hole there, why the distributions of something change through time. And I don't think that linked open data are gonna magically give us unexpected answers about our questions, to our questions about the ancient world, but I think that they are linked open data visualizations are a valuable tool to point out things, to discover things that might be investigated further. I think that they are very good pointers. And also, well, they encourage data reuse. They are basically built on the idea that you have to share your data. You have to allow people to do something else and something new with what you did, which I think is the right approach in the digital humanities. And another a point that I wanted particularly to spend some words about is producing those RDF statements that he was talking about, which is not always, a very easy operation, because if you think about how complex are the concepts that classicists and archaeologists and ancient historians, or actually all researchers in academia work with, it's not always easy to express information about this concept or these complex objects in 3-word sentences, which is exactly what RDF is. And this can be, a very stimulating, fascinating, but also challenging, infuriating operation. And for example, how do you express ambiguity or uncertainty, and how do you deal with fuzziness of humanities data? And something that I always meet in my own research is, for example, how do you model change and things that evolve through time and even through space? And how do you express the fact that they are different, but also the same thing? And the answer to that is that really you don't always have to be that granular and that specific. You can, of course, but you don't always have to. And it's very easy to get slightly obsessed with this ideal goal of representing everything, every nuance of information in RDF when you're working on a data set. But that is not always the best thing that you can do to your own research. And sometimes saying that there is a relationship between two things, that is already very, very valuable, because maybe that relationship wasn't, self-evident, and you're pointing out that those two things are somehow connected, and that, can already be a very, very useful piece of information to someone else. And let's say that there is a spectrum of how detailed and how granular, or if you want, how manic you can be about describing the things that you are working with in RDF when you create linked open data. And there is one end of this spectrum that is the simple choice, that is the open annotation data model. And this is really just saying this thing as a relationship with this other thing, and that's it. And there are some other, very basic notions that you can express in the open annotation data model, but you could also, just really stop here. So for example, if you are creating an annotation, in Recogito, let's say that is just the thing I am more familiar with. You have a part that is the body and a part that is the target. So, for example, if you are saying that the word Thebes here in the text correspond to the place Thebes that is in Pleiades at this specific URI, that is, that can be uniquely identified with this URI, that would be the body of your annotation. This would be the target of your annotation. And you have created an annotation in the open annotation format, and that is already, saying something about that text, that it has a reference to that place. Or you could move, to the other end of the spectrum and use what it's called the SidoxCRM data model that Hugh mentioned before, that was initially developed for museum artifacts, but then it grew a lot to the point of covering many fields. And it is possibly the most comprehensive ontology that is available. And just to give you an idea of, let's say, how much distance there is between a standard and a data model that says, okay, you can just say there is a body and there is a target, to the SidoxCRM, and this document is just the index of the classes of the current version of the SidoxCRM guidelines. And as you can see, I mean, classes and then properties, as you can see, it's a very long list. And if we, for example, want to use the Sparkle endpoint of the British Museum website and look up an artifact like the Rosetta Stone that we know Monica is very fond of, we get a lot of results about the Rosetta Stone that have all information that has been encoded by the team of the British Museum in the SidoxCRM format. And you see we have 11 pages of results that say a lot of things about the Rosetta Stone, about the provenance, about the material, about the date, about other documents that are connected with it, and so on. And of course, there are also a lot of intermediate steps. I mean, you don't have to choose either, the simplest or the most complex. You can find a middle ground that is that works well with your research. And really, there is no right way necessarily to do it. It's really very much about what is useful to you, what fits better your research needs. And both approaches have, of course, pros and cons. And the main one is that there is a very explicit curve, because the more complicated the ontology becomes, the more difficult to use also it is. So a lightweight approach like the open annotation approach, it is very easy both to learn, especially for people that don't have a lot of digital expertise, and it's also relatively quick to create and produce the linked open data. It is easier to link to other resources, but of course, at the same time, the quality of the connections that you're making are not as rich as they could be. You're just saying, there is a connection, and this connection can be completely opaque, like why these two things are related. And then it's up to the, let's say, the human component, to the actual researcher to go and investigate and find, further information why these two things look related in this graph. On the other hand, more, let's say, heavily rich, heavily detailed description in Rdf of the objects in a data set, it requires a lot of time to learn how to use the SidoxCRM, and it requires a lot of time to actually do the modeling of the information in SidoxCRM. But I mean, once you have done it, then you can query it, and you can get maybe very satisfactory results for your queries. It requires, let's say, a bit of a philosophical endeavor, which can be a pro or a con, so that depends from the people. But also, for example, specifically for the SidoxCRM, which is not the only complex ontology out there, but I'm inclined to say it is the most complex. The SidoxCRM is also a standard. It's an ISO standard. So let's say that could be something to factor in when thinking, for example, of longer term preservation. But as he was saying, finding the right ontology, it's entirely up to the single project, and you shouldn't feel bad about mixing and matching them. And And if there are gaps, if there are things that you really cannot find in any other ontology, by all means, create your own. Although I would advise that that is really the last result. I would say that the best practice is really to make the most of what is already out there. And I think that that was, yes, my very last theoretical slide. And now I will very quickly walk you through some examples of projects that deal with the ancient world, or with specifically with ancient culture heritage, and did use linked open data technology. And we can start with something that you probably have already heard of, which is numisma.org, which was a collaborative project that wanted to create a standard to describe information about numismatic collections. And all the partners of this initiative that you can see here in the project page, they all published the information about their data sets in this shared standard. So you can now cross search. You can perform searches across the different databases. Numisma is one of those projects that let people access information about the data sets through a Sparkle endpoint, which may not be the let's say, the easiest way to access data, because personally, I find it very, very counterintuitive, and I tend to forget how to do it as soon as I don't use it. But one thing that I wanted to show you is that Numisma also has some Sparkle queries examples, just to give you an idea of the things that you could query in Numisma. For example, all the coins of a certain type that were found in a certain radius of a certain place. And as you can see, the richer is the modeling of the information about the objects, the finer and the more precise is the query that you can perform. By the way, looking at this pre-made sample queries is also quite a good way, I think, to approach Sparkle query if you want to learn, or to remind how it works if you tend to forget about it, as I do. Another example I wanted to mention is the open context. That is, it takes quite different approach. It's actually a publishing platform for archaeological information. And what the open context does is basically allows archaeologists and researchers in this area to publish different kind of documents that relate to their project, also in very different formats, like, for example, text documents, but also small databases and geographical information, and even 3D files. I think that we can, yeah, just show, yeah, some examples of it. Okay, this was probably, yeah, not the richest example, but you get an idea. And the reason why I wanted to specifically mention the open context is that I was recently at a talk where it was presented, and they were saying that archaeologists had been actually able to find new information once their database, once the documents about their excavation got connected to the documents about another excavation that took place in a very, very near area. And I think that that made, you know, the perfect argument for why it is important to have our data, to have the outcome of our research semantically connected. It was actually a way to prove that linked open data is able to generate new information. And just for the sake of transparency, I have to say that it is free for everyone to browse the documents published in open context, but to be published in open context and to be, you know, for your documents to be hosted and maintained, there is a fee. There is a fee to pay. Another project that uses linked open data format to allow different collections to be cross-searched is Claros, which brings together different databases of images of ancient artifacts, and in a way it is relatively similar to Numisma. Let's say it does the same thing for images, but it has a more friendly user interface where you can actually either type a word you're interested in, a keyword you want to search the database according to, and let's try siren, and then you can refine your search by material or the place where it was found and so on. And each of these results, of course, brings you on click to the related original database. And I think this is another very, very, very important point about linked open data, that is, that we don't need to duplicate the data. We can just point at data that are in other repositories. And I think that this is very important and avoids redundancy and avoids duplication. And I think it goes into the direction of making the web a more efficient, a more rational resource. And let's say something that is maybe in between these last two projects is Ariadne, which is, again, I would say something like a portal that allows you to explore a number of archaeological resources. And there are various ways to enter this interface. And one is just to write your keywords here, as we have seen before, but you can also browse by place or by time or by the most common keywords, if you like. Yeah, let's get creepy and look at burials, for example. And you see heat maps of distribution and the time slides, and you have here all the each of the resources that are returned, and they have a different icon if they are places or objects. And this page, they are mostly places, but for example, if we search for ISIS, we see also icons for object connections, and we can, for example, also filter and say that we are also interested in the temples that are dedicated to ISIS, and we have, we have fewer results, and then we can again click on the original entry, and we go to the entry for the Temple of Isis in Pompeii in the Ariadne database. And last, I will conclude with Peripleo, which is Pelagio's tool to visualize linked open data. And Pelagio's project is basically all built on the idea that connecting resources, connecting the information that we have about the ancient world is useful, and it makes our data more interesting. So Peripleo is basically, let's say, a proof of concept of what we could do if we did connect our data. And we have not too shabby number of partners, and the good thing, I believe, is that these datasets are datasets of different kind of documents, different kind of resources. We have gazetteers, but we also have numismatic data, and we also have museum objects, and we can search across all of them. And of course, this is true. This is true for Peripleo, as is true for all of these resources that we have seen so far. The results that we get are not absolute. The results that we get relate only to those databases that we are querying, so they can be slightly misleading. We have to be quite careful to keep that in mind. And there are various ways to query Peripleo. You could start, for example, querying for one place, and you would see that you have different kinds of resources that relate to that place, and all the gazetteers that we have in Peripleo are identified by this circular icon with a different color and letter. And when we are sure that the different gazetteers are aligned, that they totally refer to the same place, then the records get conflated and we have one single, let's say, meta item in Peripleo that refers to the place. But we have, yes, geographic data, and we have numismatic data, and we have object data, and we see that, quite predictably, most of the information is located, around the actual position of the place. But we also have, some odd results that, it may be interesting to investigate further. And we can break down our results by sources. We could see what are the sources that have actually contributed to our results, and in what proportion. And we have time slides. And actually, to show you the use of the time slide, I will make another search about a kind of object this time, and I will go for a coin, because we have a quite sweet number of numismatic entries. You can see we have more than 23,000 results for tetradrachm. And one thing that you could do, for example, is to filter by time and see how the distribution changes, and what are the more prominent places at the beginning of the time span, and how they change during time, and how places that used to be prominent actually are not that prominent anymore, and how the thing slowly become less and less relevant in the ancient world. Or we could, just to have fun, we could simply look for something that, we like, a keyword like ship. Let me clear the cache first. And let's try ship again. Okay, that's more like it. And we get quite a number of, different results, from places that have the word ship in their names to, object records that are about, sunken ancient ships, or even annotated text that relate somehow to ships. Like, for example, if we click here, we get the annotations of the histories by Herodotus, where they discuss ships around Athens. So my point was that the documents can be quite varied, and I think that is possibly the most interesting added value in Peripleo, is that you can really connect on a common basis very, very different kind of resources. And Peripleo is totally based on a lightweight approach, so the connection is usually very straightforward, and it is displays as a relation with this document. But that relation can be, it can be a find spot, it can be a museum that holds that artifact, it can be a place of mint for a coin, and so on. But still, I think that even this let's say, lighter approach to linked open data is still incredibly informative, and it's definitely the getaway to asking different questions and new questions about the data that we have about the ancient world and ancient cultural heritage. And that was my last example. So I would stop screen sharing so you don't get dizzy.
Okay, Valeria, thank you very much.
I'm still screen sharing.
Okay, so Well, I know that we have students, but they are following us on YouTube, I think, because yes, and also Leipzig students who are encouraged to join the Hangout. And if you, okay, here, and we have questions from Anise, excellent.
That looks like a Recogito question, so maybe Valeria should answer it.
Sorry, before for the audience, because I think that people on YouTube, they can't see the chat. So Anise in the Google Hangout is Anise has a project in Brazil for producing a digital version of a Greek-Portuguese dictionary. And so the question, yes, there is a question here in relation to linked open data. So if the user Recogito, for example, to annotate URIs to the proper names in Portuguese, will the names in Portuguese be able to be linked and available to be used in other services by others? So I have to read the question. So I think this is a question for Valeria, probably.
Yes, I think so. Okay, two things that I wanted to say. One is that we are working on translating Recogito's interface in as many languages as possible. And we don't have Portuguese yet. So if Anisa and her students are interested in collaborating to this common endeavor, I would be very happy to forward her the documents. We already have Farsi and German, Italian, Spanish, French, Hebrew, Turkish. So we would be really, really thrilled to have Portuguese as well. About the annotations in Recogito, the thing is that Recogito is, let's say, personal space to create your annotations. Once you create your annotations in Recogito, then it is up to you what you do with them. There is no automatic direct link between what you do in Recogito and what, for example, is visualized in Peripleo. But you can create your annotations in Recogito, download them, and then, for example, submit them to, I don't know, Pleiades if they're interested, or some other gazetteer that might be interested in getting Portuguese place names of ancient places. But Recogito is, let's say, it's a tool, it's an intermediate step. You can use it to create the annotations, but it's not a publishing platform. Creating the annotation in Recogito doesn't make it, necessarily connected, and it doesn't make at all them to be connected to other linked open data. But if you need some assistance, some support to do some work in this direction, I would be very glad to help you, to give you some advice. No problems.
Valeria, thank you. Given that this is the first common session, and as I said, we also have students, they are not in the Hangout, but they follow us on YouTube. You can ask questions through YouTube in our chat, so just to let you know. And for students from next week, please join our Hangout. Don't be shy. I understand. The only problem we have is that we can only host 10 people in the Hangout, and then you can participate in the Hangout. And if you don't get the URL of the Hangout, please email me. So one thing for you and Valeria, well, first of all, thank you for this presentation, especially because this is the first common session. So through linked open data, you presented fundamental things for working in this case with ancient world data. So we talk about, as we can see, in the slides. So open licenses, and we spent time in Leipzig with students in digital philology talking about licenses, then stable URIs, open standards, referenceable data resources. So these are, well, fundamental technical things, and then decisions about data. You mentioned the problem of names.
Yes.
You mentioned my name, yes, a contemporary name, first name, last name, but with ancient onomastics, we can get more in trouble. So when we have long names with different, we know that, so the problem. So, yeah, so this is a fundamental thing. So to know the data and to decide the correct things at the beginning of a project. So here I can read, yes, fundamental things. When you start a project, you have to take these decisions. One thing for you, so on GitHub, in our class outline, you also put an essay title and an exercise. Can you explain this a bit for students, if you don't mind? So just to go through it, because I have new students I know, so they are new to Sunoikis, and so maybe they want to know how this works. So they follow us online, and then they can work on these exercises. So I see here, so we have, well, the slides. The slides are already online, the description of the class outline. We have 2 seminar readings, no, more than, yes, different readings. And then the essay title. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, Valeria actually wrote both of these. I just edited them slightly, so you should chip in. But the essay is essentially to think around these questions of is it better to do sort of lightweight versus heavyweight information modeling? And there are obviously advantages and disadvantages to both. I tend to fall quite heavily on the lightweight side, mainly because usually if you're doing a project, there's all this other stuff that's really important and really fundamental, and that you really want to get right. And Valeria made the point, which is exactly right, that you can kind of get sucked into the information modeling side of things and never come out again. And so, if you end up spending all of your time modeling your stuff in SciDoc CRM, do you actually have something useful on the other end of that, or do you just have a great ontology? And I think it's much better to get the fundamentals right first, and then start thinking about the semantic side of things. But Valeria, if you want to add something, please do.
And one thing, Hugh, thank you for this. This is very important. This is something I think that we have been learning with our projects, especially when we know very well our data. The temptation is to have a complex ontology. I want to do everything, but then in the end, you have too big ontology with many labels, too many. And
yeah, so it's like an addictive drug for smart people. You can really just spend all of your time doing just that.
Exactly. So thank you. Okay.
Yeah, no, I as a person that created an ontology.
Yeah, me too.
for a PhD, I know that it can really get you. But I decided, as you said, to keep it as simple as possible, just because I realized that otherwise I would have been the only person using it, because no one has the time, to learn a new ontology. But I think that we shouldn't tell, the students what to think about it. And so
no, I agree.
I mean, half of the people that I meet are, very strong SciDoc CRM evangelists, I call them, which, it's a charged term, but, and they believe, it is the way to go, and they make, perfectly reasonable, arguments about it. So I I'm more interested in for the students to look at both sides, and then of course you choose what is more practical, what is more reasonable, according also to how much time you have, how much money you have, how many collaborators can work on it. Those are all factors, I think, to be considered. But I think that it's important nonetheless to have a clear picture of the entire scene, and then deciding what suits you better.
Yeah. The other thing I'd add to that is, and you made this point very well, is we very often have to deal with kind of vague and even contradictory pieces of information, and how do you deal with that properly? And it can be very, very hard to do that with these kind of semantic modeling mechanisms. Maybe you're better off having a paragraph of text that explains what the problem is, so that kind of thing crops up all the time. Dates are disputed. What is this person's name really? What exact location was this thing produced at? That kind of thing is really messy.
Indeed.
Yes, exactly. So for the exercise, Valeria, can you?
Yes, for the exercise we have, let's say, two options. Let's say the basic one, and one for those that feel a little bit brave. So the basic one, it's not too challenging. It's just choosing one of the portals or services that we have showed that use linked open data, and perform a number of searches. You can use only one, you can use more than one, but perform at least, I don't know, 12, 15 queries on it. And then look at the data and look critically at the data. Did you find, in the visualization or in the just in the list of results, did you see something that was unexpected? Did you see something that it's possibly an indication of something else that you might want to research further? Or is the data incomplete, or you would have liked to do something else with that data, but it was not possible because the interface didn't let you? And that is another, I think, useful point to discover. But mainly I wanted the students to try to use these resources, because they can be very useful, and a lot of work has been put into them. And I think that especially students that approach the classics now, maybe they just don't know about them. So I think that it was a useful thing to just try them and see what you can get out of them. And if it is not much or not enough, I think that is a perfectly valid thing to say, at the end of an exercise, like, yes, I tried it, I understood how it works, I performed some searches, and I didn't find anything that was really relevant to my research. And I think that is actually a very important feedback for everyone that works in linked open data. The second option for the people that really got excited about linked open data is to choose a very short text, really a fragment or something, and identify a little number of entities that that may be relevant to you. They can be people, they can be places, or if you want to even look at I don't know, concepts or something else. But I would say that people and places might be very good examples. And then look at the load ontology that Hugh was talking about, and try to express the information that you have about these people or these places in Rdf format. And remember to use URIs when you talk about things. So if you're talking about a person, don't use the name of the person, but maybe use, you know, the VIAF URI for that person. Or if you're talking about a place, use the Pleiades URI for that place. And try to express, I mean, you don't have to be extremely, you know, detailed, but try to express some information in RDF. Looking at that ontology. If you don't find in that ontology the properties, the relationships that you wanted to express, try, you know, making, you know, try making your own, trying having this, you know, mock relationships, but do it properly, like, you know, find a prefix for your ontology and use the prefix when you declare the relationships.
Okay, excellent, Valeria, really, thank you very much. So now our time is over, yes. Yeah. I have to stop broadcasting, so thank you very much for this great session, for your contribution. And we will meet again next week with the second common session on the Classical Language Toolkit with Patrick Burns. So thank you very much, good night. And well, for you, maybe good night. Yes, here we are in Europe. For you, I don't know what to say. So, well, have a good night.
Good afternoon. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Monica.
Bye. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.